Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm so happy to see you all, and I'm so very pleased for this remarkable turnout that we have for this book, Radical Mindfulness. I've got my hard copy. I know some of you have got the PDF. But regardless, I'm really pleased with the support that the Rowe Center has offered to us, that the author James Rowe, I mean, he's the one that gave us the free PDF. The publisher, Routledge, has offered the 30% discount. So there's been some real enthusiasm and a really big yes for this book. As I mentioned earlier, the meeting's being recorded. And we're going to be posting it to the Rowe YouTube channel so that if people miss, they can still catch up and they can be part of the conversation. It'll end up being a little bit like a podcast that you could maybe listen to later. So we're going to talk about the format. Matthew, I can't see you, but I see that you came in. Because we have a really big group, what we're going to try for this first week is we have designated readers among ourselves. So myself, the beautiful and wonderful Karen Reppin, who is in the US, and she is both a dear friend and also works in death care. So, you know, we have some pretty good conversations. My daughter-in-law, Alex Depna, who's a nurse and is upstairs, will be one of our readers as well. And Matthew Stillman, who is a poetry teacher and also a very dear friend, and is the person who introduced me to this style of book club. So you might be feeling a little bit of, what is it that we're doing? This is strange. But once you see how this works, I think you're going to be a convert, as I am, that, you know, this is absolutely my favorite way to do book club. It allows for so much engagement. It allows us to ask questions and, you know, go a little bit deeper into the text as we need to. With a smaller group, we would all maybe take turns reading, and that can come later. I think what I want is for you to sort of see how this works first, and then in subsequent weeks, we might just say, hey, we'll all do the reading. But there's never any homework. We're going to read together, pausing as needed. And it's why it's probably going to take us about 6 months to get through to you know, read the entire book. But I think it's a really sweet way to be together as well. Like, we're actually doing this together. So although we have designated readers, at any point, if you want to jump in with a question, if there's something that you want to say more about, if there's something that really strikes you as an interesting phrase, as something that you want to, you know, comment on, Matthew, please.
Well, I also would say that as a reader, part of your job is to listen to what's not being said. And so the things that you're reading out loud yourself, you hear your own voice, to think, I should probably read this part a little bit more slowly because this is meaty, or I'll bet you someone has a question about this. Um, but without being obsequious, like, so does everyone know what the word, death mean? What's our feeling about death? Oh, I'll increase my volume. Please
Yeah,
hold on.
I was just going to say you're a little bit soft.
All right, fine.
So soft, Matthew.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a
Mm-hmm.
delicate flower.
So the interruptions are very welcome. It is a feature of doing book club this way. So don't hesitate. Matthew, you want to try again?
I haven't turned it up yet.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying.
Uh,
I have a question, Kelly.
Yes, please, Karen.
Well, what Matthew just mentioned about having a question about what does death mean to me, is there a way that we can share resources while throughout this process?
I think that's a great idea. And I mean, there's at a minimum, we have the chat during our call, but uh, I would love to have an ongoing way to be in communication. I'll send out again. So some of you were already here. I mentioned that James Rowe has offered to do a meditation for us that we could gather together and, you know, I mean, a little bit of heart tending in the midst of everything that's happening right now. So perhaps in the email, we could also talk about that could be used as a way to share resources. You know, you could reply with whatever it is that you want shared. I know lately WhatsApp groups seems to be a pretty popular way to go. Does anybody have a suggestion in that regard?
I guess another question would be maybe to have a Google Doc or something that we could, or
Sure.
a folder where we could put stuff.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's just when Matthew asked that, I'm working on a presentation where I have all kinds of questions about identifying your own core beliefs around death. And
yeah. So let me
Well,
come back to that. I think it's a great idea, Matt.
yeah, I would just say that my volume is fixed. Hopefully, is it fixed,
Yeah,
Karen?
that's much better.
yes,
Great. It's just that without being obsequious when you're a reader about stopping at every point, because we're not trying to get to the end. We're trying to inhabit it without trying to treat the book like an udder that we're going to try to milk every single piece of meaning from it. So you can be an annoying reader if you sort of say, so do we, just for example, in the first paragraph, you can say, British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. Does everyone want to name, the indigenous people from the place that they're from? Well, we're going to be here all night. And well, I don't know. Well, what's the implications of that? Like, not to say that those conversations couldn't happen, but to try to make them happen is not part of this either.
Right, right.
You'll see how it goes.
Yeah,
We all will.
it's really a very engaging way to read, I would say. I do also want to say a little bit about how this idea came to be. And so I read this book more than a year ago, and I was just so struck by, again, some of you heard me say, Karen and I are both in death care, and the idea that the existential fear of death is a real driver of human behavior absolutely makes sense to me. And I see it reflected in society so often that we have this denial around limits, and we, never mind that we don't want to talk about death, but there's just such a difficulty that we have around uncertainty, around a lack of control. This idea originates with Ernest Becker, who wrote The Denial of Death, the Pulitzer Prize winning book that came out in the 1970s. And it has since been developed into terror management theory. So this is really well understood, this existential fear of death as an unconscious but powerful influence on us as humans. And I'm going to share, before we jump in, a little quote from Judith Butler that again reinforces this understanding. And in Precarious Life, she says, the body implies mortality, vulnerability, agency. The skin and the flesh expose us to the gaze of others, but also to touch and to violence. So the author that's commenting on this says, it is also with the body that we gaze at each other, caress them, and hurt them. Vulnerability is the basis of care and harm, compassion and torture. So that's not specifically related to this book, but I was really struck by it that, oh, this vulnerability that we have is such a core aspect of us. And it is both the opportunity for care and for harm. And I was really thinking about, again, relative to news in recent months, it's not a new thing, but it's just been amplified. There's such an insistence on invulnerability, on being, sort of the tough guys and being strong. And so that's very much in my purview right now, or in my field of noticing, that not only are we death avoidant, we even don't want to acknowledge that we might be vulnerable, that we might have, an ability to receive harm with these soft animal bodies, as Mary Oliver might say. So, as I say, I read this book. I was absolutely struck by the message. And the other thing that I really, really appreciated about it is that the author, James Rowe, is offering a solution of sorts. And it's not the one thing, it's not the thing that will fix everything, but he talks about what it is that we might do if we are interested in dismantling these systems of oppression. And it is the existential fear of death that is leading to systems of oppression, because it's how we might be trying to achieve control by controlling others. Of course, we're going to get into that in the text, which makes me feel like maybe we should just get started, because, of course, I can't say it any better than James Rowe has. So before we really get going, any questions, anything that feels a little bit unclear? We're ready to dive in. Again, if something comes up, just go ahead and unmute, or you can pop it in the chat. I'm going to suggest that we start with the introduction.
An opening.
Do you want to read the opening? We can start.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with the opening.
Context, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the opening, a conversation with Dylan Thomas, who is from the Quilthium Nation. Pardon my poor pronunciation there. Dylan Thomas, whose mandala is the cover art for this book, is a Coast Salish artist and member of the Layakson First Nation of Valdez Island, one of the Gulf Islands on the Salish Sea. Quilthium is his Coast Salish name. The Coast Salish are an ethno-linguistic group of indigenous peoples who live in presently named British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. They are a diverse grouping of peoples with related but distinct cultures and language. Through his paternal lineage, Dylan has heritage from the Songhees and the Squamish nations, and through his maternal lineage, he has heritage from the Snunumics and Stolo nations. I first saw Dylan speak at a conference, In the Present Moment, Buddhism, Contemporary Art, and Social Practice, held at the University of Victoria, where I work. The university stands on Coast Salish, particularly Songhees, Esquamut, and Wasanic territories, which I live on as a white settler descended from Scottish, Irish, and English ancestors. During his presentation, Dylan explained the origin of his interest in Buddhism and shared a reflection on his late grandmother. After suffering through multiple illnesses and near her end, she exhibited an acceptance, grace, and generosity of spirit in the face of death that his 20-year-old self found inspiring. Having struggled with a fear of death since his youth, Dylan's experience of his grandmother's fearlessness was transformative. Dylan had seen other relatives resist the reality of death at the end of their lives. He'd witnessed the pain and suffering this resistance layered onto an already difficult situation. When it was his time to go, he wanted to follow his grandmother's lead. Matthew, over to you.
He searched for resources to help transform his relationship to death. Friends recommended Buddhism, given the central role that impermanence and the acceptance of it plays in Buddhist cosmology. Dylan began reading Buddhist texts, practicing meditation, and as a young artist, studying Buddhist art. He was particularly taken by the Tibetan Buddhist mandalas, which are used as tools for meditation, including meditations on impermanence. The word mandala means circle in Sanskrit. Dylan noticed resonances between Buddhist mandalas and Coast Salish forms that he was learning as an artist, particularly the focus on symmetrical balance. Likewise, the circular form of mandalas matched the traditional Coast Salish practice of carving spindle whorls with intricate designs. A spindle whorl is a small disc, traditionally made from animal bone, stone, or wood, with a hole in the center that a shaft of wood can fit through. The tool was used by Coast Salish women to spin fleece into a thick yarn for weaving textiles of social and spiritual significance. When the intricately designed whorl spun, it could have a mesmerizing or meditative effect on the weaver. Mandala was Dylan's first cross-cultural work of art, inspired both by Coast Salish and Buddhist art, and for him, the piece is both a mandala and a spindle whorl. Given that this project engages both Buddhist and Coast Salish cosmologies to understand how different cultures have transformed fear of death into a deep acceptance of earthly life, thereby reducing destructive behaviors, Dylan's mandala is perfect for this book. While finishing up the manuscript, I sat down with Dylan in his home studio to ask him about mandala, the cycle of life and death, and his relationship to Buddhism. I began by returning to the story he told 3 years earlier about his grandmother's grace and generosity at the end of her life, and I asked him how he thought she'd achieved her equanimity. He explained that she'd had health problems throughout her life and almost died multiple times. He thought her multiple encounters with finitude had nurtured acceptance. Dylan described his grandmother as a deeply inquisitive person, hungry for spirituality. She'd been dispossessed from her Coast Salish culture when her grandmother was forced by the colonial Canadian government to give up her Indian status, quote unquote, upon marrying a non-Indigenous man. This patriarchal rule removed many Indigenous people from their land, relationships, and life world. Dylan described his grandmother as a voracious reader. He still tenderly holds a mental image of her enjoyment in reading a book while smoking a cigarette. She read Buddhist texts, was fascinated by ancient Egypt, and appreciated Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. Following his grandmother's lead, Dylan sought cross-cultural learning at the same time, but he and his family deepened connections with their Coast Salish culture. I was curious about the formal elements in Dylan's design and their relationship to the circle of life and death. Traditionally, Tibetan Buddhist mandalas include an outer ring of 8 circles that represent charnel or burial grounds. When I asked him why these 8 outer circles appear in his Coast Salish design, Dylan returned to the transformative experience of his grandmother's death. Her equanimity contrasted with his own anxieties about death. I don't know where that fear comes from. I avoided looking at it for years, then realized that if I didn't face my fears until the end of my life, things might get really bad. Dylan explained that his Buddhist practice helped nurture a healthier relationship to death. I can accept it. I don't have to run away from the idea anymore. Elsewhere, Dylan has written about Coast Salish teachings on facing life's challenges without fear. In this book, I discuss some of the resonances between Buddhist and Coast Salish efforts to encounter death as an integral part of a total life process. I asked Dylan to describe what staying with his experience, what being present felt like to him, whether meditating, engaging in other spiritual practices, or making his art. He shared his struggles with anxiety as a teenager. It was this constant buzzing like the static from a dead radio channel. The sudden absence of this anxiety during practices of presence provided him with a new baseline to work from. Absent the buzz of anxiety, Dylan described a sense of awe at reality, so real it feels unreal at times. It's so crazy that we live in this world where all these things work the way they do. In the artist statement for another work, Setting Sun, Dylan writes, "All things in this universe must come to an end eventually, and although people tend to fear this fact, when one thing ends, it always produces more opportunities for other things to arise. A setting sun is a transition point in between one of these changes, and in order for the beauty of the moon and stars to light up the sky, the day must come to an end." I asked him why he thought so many people turn away from the reality of death when it is so fundamental to cycles of life. Dylan explained that it is perfectly natural to be terrified of death and the seeming abyss it signals. We cope with those fears by imagining ourselves as permanent and discrete from the topsy-turvy outside world. We have this ego that tells us we're separate from the world. We're in here and the scary world is out there, and I have to protect myself from what's out there. This view is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding. This false view aggravates the situation by disconnecting us from other people, other beings, and the fullness of life, including death. Encased in our self-woven cocoons, our fear of the real world, what Dylan describes as the flow of impermanence, only grows, seeking to shield ourselves from uncertainty and pain. We can also become disconnected from the fullness and beauty of the world until we can deconstruct our defenses through spiritual practice. Dylan's art and worldview are influenced by Buddhism, and while it is always rooted in Coast Salish forms, his art is also informed by Islamic tessellations and Celtic knots. In previous interviews, he's explained that bridging different cultural art forms helps him feel the underlying connections across humankind. I asked him why cultivating a feeling of connection across difference is so important to him, and he explained that as a young person growing up in Victoria, he experienced a lot of racism. Feeling that otherness and divisiveness made me want to really understand cultures that were different from mine. Dylan did not want to replicate the dismissiveness and cultural supremacy that he experienced from white settlers. He wanted to experience the diversity of human cultures with open-hearted curiosity. Studying different cultural art forms became really important to me. In his studies, Dylan noticed weird parallels across cultures. For example, he explained that the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, is a symbol that appeared in Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, Norse, and Salish art and tradition. For Dylan, all these cultures are gathering from the same source and putting their own local flavor on it. When you start seeing those similarities, it's really hard to look at different people as others. Humor, music, and visual arts are all found in all cultures. For Dylan, these practices don't make much evolutionary sense. They don't have obvious pragmatic value. Although there's no humor in Dutch Reform Presbyterianism. That's just not funny. We all know this. Just want to say. Um, for Dylan, these practices don't make much evolutionary sense. They don't have obvious pragmatic value. And yet, they are universal cultural forms regularly gathered from the same source, from a present-minded encounter with the fullness of reality or the flow of impermanence. Despite finitude, or perhaps even because of it, there's a richness to life. For Dylan, both art and spiritual practice are ways of touching that richness, allowing it to shape our being.
I'm gonna jump in for a second to note two things. One, I was interested in, when he was asked about his grandmother's equanimity and peace at her death, why did he think that was the case? That he said, oh, because she had almost died multiple times. And so it immediately made me think about, again, with contemplative practices, that very often the meditation is on death, that we imagine our ultimate dissolution. And so this is like, it's just mirroring that, oh, it actually seems to help, that in approaching that moment, and whether it's, in this case where she actually did almost die, or whether it's just in our contemplative way, that it seems to be a way of being, having a certain, again, grace and generosity, as he says in that moment. But the other two things that are really jumping out for me, the sentence, seeking to shield ourselves from uncertainty and pain, we also become disconnected from the fullness and beauty of the world. And the line that you just read, Matthew, despite finitude, or perhaps even because of it, there's a richness to life. And that is really echoing for me. And Karen, maybe you'd have something to say, but, again, being in death care, I hear often that, the people will say, like, it must be really depressing. And, I tease a little bit and say, we're actually a really fun bunch. But it's because we have this ongoing encounter with how precious life is. And so there's this amplification of joy that happens. So I'm just appreciating what he's saying about that here. And yeah, Karen, maybe you want to weigh in too.
I'm just thinking about how my fear of death was so great when I had nothing but tragic death examples to refer to. And when I started working with people who were having more they were expecting death to come for a variety of reasons, many of whom began to, I don't know if it was making peace, but they were less resistant. And there's, for many reasons, less resistance. That's part of the process in my understanding at this point. But as I witnessed and accompanied people during their end of life, it became so much less frightening. And, you know, so many of I'm now old enough that I've had many dear people die. And I've actually gotten to the point now where it's kind of like, well, if they can do it, I can. It's like they're showing that it's something, I mean, it's really putting some, I hate to use, well, meat on the bone of, this is real, this is inevitable, there's no way around it. Let's just be curious about it rather than terrified. But I, for one, I experienced much of my life absolutely terrified of death. And I'm not saying I want to go, but I'm not so terrified now.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how that connects to politics. Well, we'll find out. This book is an effort to better understand the ugly habit of denying connections across difference and seeking supremacy instead of relationship. This is a habit that Euro-descended people, such as myself, have historically struggled with, mightily so. Encountering colonial history in all its brutality, it's understandable to wonder if there might be something fundamentally wrong with white settler people such as myself. And yet, having personally experienced similar feelings of awe, described by Dylan, feeling the richness of the world coursing through my organism during meditation practice, I don't think there is some original sin driving the injustices committed by Euro-descended people such as myself. The same holds for injustices committed elsewhere in the world, whether it is the Chinese occupation of Tibet, patriarchal social relations within Tibet before the Chinese invaded, or even particular practices of slavery by Coast Salish people hundreds of years ago. Each of these cases is shaped by historical specificity, and yet I wrote this book to gather insights from Buddhist, indigenous, Black, terror management, and feminist thinkers who point to existential fear, particularly the fear of death, as an under-examined explanation for the will to supremacy that haunts human histories. Drawing from across these different traditions, I argue that without cultural resources for transforming existential fear, it's easy to feel small in the face of finitude and compensate by imposing ourselves on other people in the more than human world to access the power that the natural world appears to deny us by always including death in the fine print of our life contracts. As our conversation came to a close, I asked Dylan what he thought explained the persistence of supremacist social relations. He answered that if we wrongly think of ourselves as discrete and permanent, we're necessarily going to fear impermanence, likewise on a social level. If you believe that you're fundamentally separate and different from other people, it's natural to be scared of them and defend against them. And if that thinking gets out of hand, that's when you get colonial conquests and wars. I'm actually a little challenged by that, not in the sense of wanting to be argumentative, but yes, there are unifying factors, but also the difference is an important thing to have the capacity to sit with. Not that that's a final truth that we shouldn't or should talk about, but just to say, I'm noticing a little bit of the rhetorical sweep here of, hey, here's the final reflection of an indigenous guy, and that it sort of gets highlighted in a particular way. I don't know if anyone else is hearing that.
I'm actually hearing the relationality of it,
Me too.
that, you know, and I don't know about indigenous sweep as much as when there is, you know, just a very different worldview or orientation. And so what is it to not carry the story of separation? You know, if you if any of us were raised believing in the idea that we're part of a web of relationship, and so maybe it's the you know it's the first hint towards the othering that happens as a result of this fear or this, idea of being separate. But I would go back to the previous 2 paragraphs ago where he says, without cultural resources for transforming existential fear, it's
Absolutely.
easy to feel small. And I was thinking as you read that, like, what cultural resources do we have?
Do
This is
we?
maybe
Yeah,
some of the trouble that,
sure. Yeah, I guess I would add to it that it's so easy to get the into the notion of opposites. Well, if we're not separate and fundamentally separate and different, then we must be unified in the same.
mm,
And that habit of the opposite must be the true thing is
yeah,
part of the inadvertent place to trip up.
sure.
Do you think that has a question about feeling a person's life is insignificant if you aren't different? It's sort of like if you're part of the greater whole, does that lessen your significance in the world? Or does it make it greater?
I'd love to hear from others, but my sense of it is that we're not limited to our individual self. And so, but again, I think for Western mind, it's very hard to think, oh, I'm more than, but it's still being filtered through this sense of individualism. And so, more means better, bigger, more important. But it's like for me, it feels like it's just a completely different way that you're perceiving things, and so you're part of this greater whole. And I love the fact that Dylan says, like, I'm scared of death too. I don't think it necessarily takes that away. But it does remove the need to defend against anybody or anything that isn't me. Because we are, again, this relational, all connected, all part of some great thing that's greater than just the self. I don't know. Do others have thoughts on that? Yeah, Bryce, please.
I don't have any personal experience with this, but I read Tyson Yunkaporta's Sand Talk that I guess a lot of you are probably familiar with.
Oh yeah.
He's Aboriginal, and his take is that on this subject, I think, is that Aboriginal peoples and other indigenous peoples are, by virtue of their being part of a greater whole, feel a greater sense of individuality. And I know that plays out in like some of the First Nation cultures that the Europeans first ran up with when they came over, like in the 17th century. The Iroquois, for instance, very independently minded. They couldn't be made to obey any authority, and that was the complaint among so many Europeans, French and English. And I think it touches on, Yunko Porta's observation. So I just want to throw that out there.
I thanks for that, Bryce. And you make me think, Matthew raised the risk of dropping into binaries, and that is such a lovely reminder that, the paradox that maybe emerges when we open ourselves up to these other ways of being. Carmen.
Oh, you're muted, Carmen. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So speaking from a Cree perspective from Alberta, when I hear about, when listening, it's really hard to keep compartments separate from what was taken from my learning, my understanding of my culture, and colonial society. I know that I was speaking to my Google, my grandmother, and we spoke verbally. We didn't write a lot of stuff down, but we used to take care of each other in a way that I don't see reflected around me anywhere in Canada. We did take we were very thoughtful. We took care of our dead. Dying was part of our community. Like that's the lessons that I know. Like it was not separate from, it was part of. So when I was listening to the reading, I was like, they're not separate, they're the same.
Mhm. Yeah, I was in a conversation about that yesterday, and how the noticing that we have taken death and made it separate from the rest of life. And what is it if it's just part of our understanding that I'm going to have breakfast and someday I'll die, and it's just, yeah, there's no, we might still be up, we might still feel fear or anxiety, but we're not in resistance. Michelle.
All the mute buttons. Just something Carmen said made me think of something. I was on a road trip recently, and we stopped at this rest area, and I don't know who this guy was, or if he was working there or just hanging out outside of the washrooms. But he started telling me his life story, about how he was in the military and his parents were in the military, and his sister was, I mean, we were in the States, so they were all Marines and whatnot. And he said almost the exact same thing that Carmen said, is we don't take care of each other anymore. He had a death, and he didn't know what to do, and he was reaching out to his family, and his family was just nowhere to be found. And so I found it interesting to hear someone else say we don't take care of each other anymore. And then I was also I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here. This also reminded me of a really good book by Dostoevsky. I don't know if anybody likes Dostoevsky in here.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. The Brothers Karamazov.
It's hilarious. Yeah.
Why? It's hilarious. Super hilarious.
Yeah. It's as funny as Dutch Reformed Presbyterians. Yeah.
You know what? I had a feeling you were going to say that.
Yeah.
Anyway, all the talk about duality and, everything being connected, that was a really big theme in that book. And so it's nice to see that come out in other areas. I forget where I was going with this, but anyway, it just reminded me of that.
Love another, book recommendation. I'm always here for it.
It's the greatest book. It's the most life-transforming book you'll ever read, even though it's not funny, but it's a great book.
Well, I'll just say that he continued, there are likely deeply held ideas and attachments that will require some detangling before it's more normal to see the underlying humanity across difference. I wrote this book in the service of detanglements, and I'm honored that Dylan Thomas's cross-cultural mandala is the doorway inside.
For those of you, I don't know with the PDF if you can see the cover, but I did drop the image into the chat if you can't see it for some reason, but it is a very beautiful mandala. Karen, you want to start chapter 1 for us? Or not chapter, the introduction rather, pardon me.
Sure. Tell me if you can hear me, okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. Introduction, fear of death as a driver of injustice. When we curse death, we only fear ourselves. George Bataille, The Accursed Share. I have long been troubled by the persistence of supremacist social relations. I'm writing this in the aftermath of a racist mass shooting in Buffalo that targeted Black people. Racist violence today is shocking, but it resonates with a long history of anti-Black brutality in North America that dates back hundreds of years to the beginnings of chattel slavery. I am writing this in the wake of federal abortion rights being overturned in the United States. We are some distance from the Salem witch trials of 1692, yet female bodily sovereignty is still under assault. I'm writing this during a period of climate emergency that threatens to undo the Holocene conditions that have supported human flourishing. This is an existential threat that resonates with a long history of ecological disregard in the Euro-Americas. London, England, had a smog problem from the beginning of soft coal as early as 1285. The burning of dead organic matter, fossil fuels, which has accelerated considerably since World War II, has us teetering on the edge of climate catastrophe. Why the painful endurance of white supremacy, male supremacy, human supremacy, and other diminutive social relations, despite the powerful social movements that, okay, so it starts out, why the painful endurance of these things and other diminutive social relations, despite the powerful social movements that have arisen throughout history to counter them? This is a question I've been asking since becoming politicized as a teenager in the late 1990s. As a white settler man, I look like the people who have pursued dominance in recent Euro-American history. I've also been a beneficiary of those relations, even as they limit my own freedom. A more fulsome biography is provided at the end of this introduction. In efforts to undo relations of supremacy, I've worked for unions such as the Service Employees International Union, joined countless protests for racial justice, gender justice, and indigenous sovereignty, worked for numerous environmental organizations, including Greenpeace, and participated in United Nations negotiations on biodiversity in Brazil and Germany. While doing all this work, I've wondered, why does social injustice seem to be a permanent part of our lives? Need it be this way? Death, the absolute master. These burning questions pushed me to pursue graduate studies in politics and the history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz, a hotspot for radical theory in politics. One possible answer began taking shape during a graduate seminar I took in my first year, The Politics of Recognition, taught by Robert Meister. The course mapped the influence and effect of Hegel's master-slave dialectic in contemporary social and political thought. Hegel's famous account of mastery and slavery appears as a short chapter of lordship and bondage near the beginning of his long treatise of, the phenomenology of spirit. It has had an enormous influence, including on critical thinkers such as Karl Marx, Franz Fanon, and Judith Butler. Hegel's abstract tale of two humans locked in a fight to the death is a classic heuristic in Euro-American political theory for making sense of diminutive social relations in the real world. Digging into this material, I was perplexed that there wasn't a more robust explanation for why two humans encountering each other for the first time wouldn't choose cooperation, play, or even a mutually pleasurable tryst. Instead, Hegel sets up a death match. The protagonist in the story is reason, and reason is seeking to know itself. Reason has agency and resides in two human consciousnesses that meet each other for the first time. In Hegel's story, reason pushes the two people to risk their animal lives in a fight to the death. It is by risking death that they begin encountering their capacity for free, reasonable action, undominated by natural directives: eat, sleep, defecate, die. For Hegel, the most basic explanation for why we humans find ourselves in a fight to the death is because reason makes us do it. Also, we can better learn to control the natural given, including death. When I first read it, I found Hegel's explanation for domination deeply unsatisfying, even bordering on the comical. The comedy troupe, the kids in the hall, once lampooned the kind of logic deployed in Of Lordship and Bondage during a skit about a support group railing against the tyranny of their bladders. They pledged to never urinate in the name of true freedom and autonomy. Well, Hegel was probably not its primary target. The skit effectively mocks the resentment toward corporeal existence that runs deep through Europe-American culture and philosophy, including the phenomenology of spirit.
I'm going to jump in, Karen, to say
Okay.
I'm really thinking about how like I think this is true in one particular culture, not necessarily only one, but that there's this assumption that everybody thinks this way. And I know in recent years there's been pushback on Lord of the Rings that I think many of us read as teenagers and probably appreciated, but that there's this new narrative around, well, that would be for, again, sort of white Western society, and in plenty of other cultures, children that were shipwrecked on an island would have worked together, and there then even real world examples were given.
Oh, you said, did you say Lord of the Rings or Lord
sorry,
of
I
the
meant
Flies?
Lord of the Flies. Pardon me.
Okay,
sorry.
thank
Yes,
you.
very, very different.
I was going to say,
example.
whoa,
Yeah.
yeah.
Lord of the Flies, and that.
Thank you.
That assumes a particular, again, I guess, way of seeing the world. And the other thing that comes up for me in the section that you just read is that, reason is part of cognition, like it is part of control. It's part of the, so again, this Western way of valuing, what's important, and that, maybe there's a great case being made for it, but it's assuming that everybody sees the world that way, and it's not necessarily true. That reason so easily becomes control and an expectation of dominion. But if you were part of a culture that saw interconnection and relationship, maybe reason wouldn't be the thing that was making the case in Hegel's essay. Maybe it would be heart, or who knows.
Will I continue?
Sure.
Kel, just before you continue, in case you want to use it, I just put into the chat the kids in the hall urination support group sketch. If you want to play it, I don't know.
Thank you. Let's leave it for people to watch if they would like
Sure,
to.
just letting you know.
Yeah, thank you.
There are subplots in Hegel's story, however, that go much further than his main narrative arc in explaining the enmity and domination that have shaped much of Euro-American history. It is noteworthy, for example, that he names death the absolute master. For him, death is the true tyrant. While he does not comment on bladder control, Hegel demonstrates deep resentment toward existential realities such as hunger and mortality, writing that true freedom is achieved only by ridding ourselves of attachment to natural existence in every single detail. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his discourse on the origin of inequality, which was an important influence for Hegel, similarly argues that nature commands every animal and beasts obey. Man feels the same impetus, but he knows he is free to go along or to resist. For Rousseau and Hegel, our freedom is found in resistance to the natural given, which is experienced as commanding and domineering. On the one hand, wanting to resist certain natural directives is perfectly intuitive. But it is also worth asking why a natural process such as death is figured as domineering instead of emblematic of a generous life process. Death fertilizes new growth that we benefit from until it is our turn to give back. Death is not inherently diminutive. This is a culturally imposed narrative that Hegel treats as fact. Exactly what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Both in 18th century Germany and pursuing higher education at a Protestant seminary, Hegel's view of death was shaped by Christianity. Surprise. Every tradition is polyvocal, and yet St. Paul's biblical view of death as punishment for humanity's original sin in the Garden of Eden is, how do you pronounce that, hegemonic?
Yep.
Or
Yeah.
hegemonic in European Christianity. I'm terribly ignorant, but I love to read. For Paul, the wages of sin is death. Romans 6:23. Redemption of escape from death are available for those who believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and thus the possibility of their own everlasting life. For Paul, death is an enemy that God can vanquish for believers. Corinthians 15:25. In his letter to the Corinthians, he explains that while the mortal human body is sown in dishonor after Adam and Eve are sentenced to fleshly life for disobeying God's word in Eden, it is resurrected in glory. Corinthians 15:43. On the Christian path, the mortal human is sown in weakness, but ultimately raised in power. When we join the kingdom of God, Corinthians 15:43, in Paul's view, we are weak and beset by the absolute enemy, what he calls the last enemy, until we accept the doctrine of resurrection. I begin to go.
I have a question or a wondering, and the viewing death as master or a tyrant versus viewing death as life feeding. And, again, Becker is asserting that this existential fear of death is inherently the human condition. But I'm wondering, is that something that we're taught? Are we taught that death is a tyrannical master? Or, do we come into the world being afraid of it? I don't know what people think.
I'll go with taught.
Yeah, Michelle, go for it.
The mute buttons. I'm sorry, I'm going to end up talking too much because these are
it's great.
really
Please.
fun topics. I agree. I think it is definitely taught because we're also taught to fear pain, and we're taught to fear differences, and we're basically just taught fear from when we're taught fear inherently since we are born, and death is kind of the ultimate scary thing. So, and it is the ultimate pain, I guess, that we are taught. So, definitely, I think that is a learned thing rather than an innate thing. I mean, because it's part of life, right? I mean, it's just another experience of life that it's inevitable.
Yeah.
I don't know why we would fear the inevitable, but it is what it is, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Even more than a pain, that it's an insult or an affront to life.
Oh,
And it's how you get so much great poetry about living on forever, and death thou shalt die, etc.
John Donne. Yeah.
John Donne, of course.
Yeah.
Glad you picked up my reference.
Oh, it's one of my favorite poems.
Oh, do you know it? Can you recite it for us?
Yeah. Death be not proud, though some have called thee both mighty and dreadful. For thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor canst thou kill me. Something like that.
From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee much more must flow. and soonest our best men with thee do go. Rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, or poppy and charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die.
That was beautiful.
I'm glad we could do it together.
I was going to say, I feel like our hearts just connected here. Talk about human connection right there.
Weird, right? Poetry.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Poetry. Who knew?
I won't say any more about poetry. I probably will, but
Well, I'm going to give Michelle a little teaser. Matthew's teaching in 2 weeks, so you'll get more of this.
I'm
Thank you both.
excited.
It's beautiful. Martha.
Y'all are so well read. When Kelly made the comment about have we learned to fear death, I immediately went to, I think my first awareness that my parents were going to die when I was extremely young. And I don't think I'd thought much about death before that. And so I'm going to argue on the opposite of Michelle, saying that it was my own, absolute abject fear of my parents, not being with me that brought me that awareness. I don't have a poem that I can recite to go with that.
you must be Dutch Presbyterian, Dutch Reform.
I could make one up on the spot, or I could,
of course,
I could recite something I made up when I was that age, but nobody wants to hear it.
Yeah.
I'm appreciating the reminder that that fear of death, it's not necessarily our own. That there's that's a reminder to be tender about the whole thing, because sometimes it's the unbearable heartbreak of losing others.
Yeah, and I'm actually really glad to hear that argument too, because I mean, how many nature videos have we watched where we see animals desperately run and fight while in the jaws, quite literally the teeth of death? That there is something quote unquote natural about it being, but do they live their entire lives in dread of that? That's a different question. But what is it like to fight for life like that? Well, yeah, that's the thing. So I'm glad to have more case made as opposed to a definitive one. So
More for the
thanks for your poem-free argument.
Alex, I saw that you had your hand up. Do you still want to weigh in?
Sure. Matthew kind of touched on it a bit there, so I don't want to reiterate everything, but I guess I was just thinking from a biological perspective that it could be more of an innate experience, like the fear of death. And I guess we touched upon like the survival aspect too, right? That if you're in that position, then yeah, you might be fearing for your life if it comes down to a survival aspect. But I guess how, on the hierarchy, like our needs, right? Where do we lie? And so how often are we thinking about it versus not thinking about it? Is it something we're compartmentalizing, or, and putting aside or not thinking about, or is it in the forefront? So I guess to sum that up, I think that it could be 50-50. I feel like I'm never weighing one way or the other, but a lot of the fear around death can come from our surroundings and how often we hear people talk about being afraid of not knowing what's next. So what parts of death are actually scary, versus having like maybe a household where death, the discussion again is more open, and you're not afraid of it, or you do have, let's say, beliefs of what happens after we die that makes it less scary, right? So finding comfort in that, versus, let's say, you have traumatic experiences with it. So yes, I find there is an environmental piece, but also maybe like less known and studied is it really just an innate experience? But I do feel like there is something there that would drive us to have a fear of that, without maybe truly understanding why exactly, but that, the loss of life, not being here and wanting those survival instincts to kick in, I feel like that can contribute to it. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
I just,
yeah, Karen.
I just was going to put this question out here. And again, it's that word fear that we're using, these 4 little letters, where I'm thinking it's kind of a catch-all for reverence and resistance. And I mean, whoever spoke about their parents' death, was it the fear of death or the fear of what life would be like without parents being available? I mean, you know, again, it's like, am I splitting hairs? But I think this sort of catch-all, it's kind of like the word hope, how you define it. You know, I think, I mean, I'm thinking back to Huron Relations, a book that some of us read, and thinking about people growing up with a death song that they practiced, and that there, you know, there's all this ritual and ceremony around celebrating death as well, being ready for. And so in the culture we're describing right now, that is foreign as far as I can tell. And so, and fear is such a, it's the hammer that makes everything a nail or whatever. Fear is used to manipulate people all the time. So why not be afraid of death? It's going to keep you in line if you get that one sunk into your head.
Yeah, can I respond to that? And I agree with you, Karen, is that at a very young age, I had no sort of container to put that in. And there was no family tradition of, you know, having somebody die in the house and, you know, people around them and leaving the body for a couple of days, you know, whatever, you know, to be viewed or whatever. So yeah, it's the lack of container, the lack of context, I guess. There was nothing for me to do other than rationalize. In my sort of youthful child mind. Thanks.
And I think too, I mean, I feel myself wanting to be cautious around not vilifying the fear, that maybe the fear belongs the way it all belongs. But then remembering Dylan's grandmother, and if we can again go to that threshold, approach it many times before the actual moment of crossing, maybe that helps to not be ruled by the fear, you know, that we learn that this is actually something that we can approach, and we can be again in that state of, as he said, grace and generosity. Michelle, what were you going to say?
Well, so far off from where the discussion has taken us now, I feel bad, but I just I remember this story called The Parable of the Onion, and it's about, you're nodding, do you know this one? No?
Yeah,
Okay. Okay, it's very good. It's about this woman who dies, and she, I guess, had a horrible life, I don't know, and she was sent to hell. And she was crying and crying and saying, "Oh, please, I'm not ready to die." So an angel comes down and says, "Okay, if you can think of one good thing that you've done in your life, you can live again." And she thinks and she thinks and she thinks, and she said, "Oh, one time I gave this old lady a spring onion." And the angel says, "Oh, great, you did one good thing. I can pull you up." But there were all these other people in hell who saw her being lifted back up, and they all started clawing at her because they wanted to be pulled up as well. And she fought against them and fought against them, and ultimately they all fell back into the fiery pits of hell, rather than just accepting. I mean, I guess it was the afterlife. It wasn't really hell, but rather than just accepting death for what it is, and her need, her desperate need not to die, also damned the other people who she could have easily have saved as well. So the whole talk about, I don't know, the fear of death, it creates these desperate attempts. I think we were talking about control earlier, these desperate attempts to control our lives. And then that also F's with other people's lives and situations as well.
Yeah. Deb? Mm-hmm.
Not sure if my thoughts are totally clear, but I just think that there's complexity here, that we have a human body that does end. It does end. So the ego, if we look at us being multidimensional and having much more than the human body, the ego human body is going to end at the end of life. It could have an inherent experience of, I don't know that I'm saying this correctly, but having this fear of death just simply because it does end. Your spirit, like if you believe that you have a spirit and the spirit lives on, it does not necessarily have a fear of death, if you will, but like it could be different parts of you. And then your nurturing has an impact on that because, I mean, being a white woman, who in my world taught me how to work through not just the fear of death, just any difficult emotion, any kind of difficulty. How do you work through that, right? And in some cultures, they are better at teaching their children that than others. So I think there's more complexity here. It's not binary. There is levels, different levels of engagement in regards to that. Anyways, my thoughts for now.
I like that reminder of, you know, the relationality exists within as well. You know, we're more than just one thing. Do you want to pick it up again, Karen, or should we hand it over to Alex?
Alex, go for it.
Someone please remind me where, I know we're on page 8, but where exactly did we finish?
I began
At the
to
bottom,
wonder.
I began.
Yeah.
Okay. I began to wonder if the servility that Hegel and St. Paul ascribed to humanity in the face of death, a case of corporeal resentment that is common across Euro-American cultures, is an under-acknowledged force behind the pursuit of dominance. Feeling unnecessarily belittled in the face of finitude, perhaps subjects impose their will on human and non-human others to pursue the compensatory power, an aggrandizement that the natural given appears to deny them. This is the argument pursued by the heterodox reader of Hegel, Georges Bataille, in his 3-volume work, The Accursed Share. Drawing from Hegel, Nietzsche, and non-Western traditions such as Tibetan Buddhism and the potlatch economies of Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples, Bataille centers death, denial, and existential resentment in his explanation of domination. For him, humans are the only animal to be ashamed of, that nature whence he comes, and from which he does not cease to have departed. This primary disdain for animal nature and our dependence upon it spurs fantastical efforts to dominate our bodies, one another, and the more than human world in attempts to offset felt servility with felt dominance. The tyranny of our bladders, and more seriously, death, be damned. In Bataille's view, the full of existential resentment is universal. It is a human struggle. He is attuned, however, to the important mediating role played by culture. Individuals and cultures relate to existential realities, like impermanence, in myriad ways. He admired, for example, the Tibetan tantric practice of meditating in graveyards. The benefit of these practices, according to Bataille, is that if existential resentment leads to compensatory self-seeking, then affirming the totality of life, including death, can produce an ethos of generosity. Graveyard meditations are designed to loosen our view of death as other, which can make us more open and less fearful of other differences and other people that appear in our life. I can still recall the excitement I felt encountering Bataille's work in my graduate class on Hegel. He offered the beginnings of an answer to the why of persistent dominative social relations in Euro-American history, and why other cultures have had more success achieving relative social equity and ecological flourishing. If you're part of a culture that figures death as a domineering master, then perhaps you will be hungrier for fantasies of supremacy that compensate for the belittlement felt before the natural given. Alternatively, if you emerge from a culture that provides resources for metabolizing understandable death fear, then maybe you'll encounter the world with more openness and non-defensiveness. Both the content and the form of Bataille's work were magnetic for me. He offered a compelling explanation for the will to supremacy shaping Euro-American history, and he did so by prefiguring a cosmopolitan political theory that chipped away at the West centrism of the tradition he'd emerged from. I didn't realize at the time how rare it was to encounter Bataille in a political theory classroom. While a key influence for better-known theorists, such as Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Judith Butler, Bataille remains a marginal figure in most political theory. As Robin Marasco recently wrote, precious little has been said about Bataille as a resource for philosophical critique and political theory. While this likely has to do with some of his unbuttoned pursuits, such as writing pornographic novels, it also fits a broader pattern. Those who write about death in a death-denying culture tend to get actively forgotten. Or, if they are remembered, their writings on death are minimized.
Ooh.
This book is an effort in recovery. I don't know if you want me to pause to comment on any of that.
That's legit.
I have two things that I want to comment on, and of course want to hear from others. But his comment that if you emerge from a culture that provides resources for metabolizing understandable death fear, then maybe we encounter the world with more openness. And so, I mean, the question came to me that, well, what does that look like? How do we metabolize the fear of death? And the other thing I wanted to say, and then folks weigh in, this idea that if you are trying to talk about death in a death-denying culture, there's this act of forgetting. And I am so often struck by how quickly amnesia set in around COVID and the pandemic. This need to forget that the amnesia seemed to be setting in even as we were still in the throes of the pandemic. So I suppose nothing else that I'm trying to say about it other than, yeah, like we see that. We see that for sure. Karen, your book collection is heavily weighted with books about death.
I know the answer to that, Karen.
Come to my house. We'll have a good time. Yeah. Others want to say anything about that? Thoughts, reflections?
I just love the last sentence, that it's a book and is an effort. This book is an effort in recovery.
Yeah. 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 I'm thinking remembering, RE dash, the putting back together the recovery is a nice spin on that. Pilar.
It's Pilar,
Pilar.
thank you.
Pilar, thank you.
I took a death, dying, grief, and loss class, and I say this because it's, when you brought up COVID, it's my belief that I don't feel like you can talk about death without like talking about all the other parts of it, right? The grief and the loss, the whole thing. And I think with COVID, it was just too much for people to deal with. It was too much. And I say this because I lost somebody, I lost two people, and I almost died myself during COVID.
Mm.
And so I would love to forget, right? I would love to be able to just put it to the side. But when it has personally touched you in that way, and it doesn't even have to be like a physical loss. It could be the loss of everything you know. It could be so many different, I feel like it's my theory that we're all grieving. We haven't stopped grieving, and we haven't even like really acknowledged that we're a nation that is still grieving.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing now is a consequence of the fact that we can't acknowledge that we are in a state of grief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Pilar. That's really moving, and I'm sorry for the very high cost that that you experienced in COVID, including losing people that you know and loved. Michelle?
I'm sorry. I keep adding stuff, but um, I what Pilar was saying really spoke to me because even in the midst of COVID, we couldn't admit that something terrible was happening. I think we were actually kind of poking on this yesterday. Like when I worked in body removal, we were picking up bodies every day, multiple times a day, of people who have died. And at the same time, I was hearing from people all around me, COVID is a hoax. COVID isn't real. They're lying about the numbers and this and that. And when you are doing that and you're seeing all the people who have died, um, it kind of goes back to that thing of how um, because we're afraid of death, or not to use the word afraid again, but because of our feelings about death, we can't actually even accept that the reality of this is actually happening. All these people around us are dying, millions of people are dying, and still can't put on a mask because, like you had said before, it's a symbol of our own mortality. We can't accept our mortality, and it's just, and yes, as Pilar was saying again, yes, we're still grieving because we just can't acknowledge, I guess, our mortality, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely. And Pilar, I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but my sense, my belief, I'll say it that way, my belief, going back to the quote from Judith Butler that I started with, that that the body implies mortality, vulnerability, agency, that is inherent to our human bodies. And I think COVID was such an affront, in the sense that those of us, I'm saying those of us, like, again, recognizing that we're part of a death avoidant culture, and in that death avoidance, we couldn't keep up that denial, that avoidance, in the midst of mass death. And so we are confronted by our vulnerability. And this is where, Pilar, when you're talking about the fact that we weren't grieving even if as it was happening, never mind now, I have a belief that some of what we're seeing now is that unmetabolized grief, is the fact that we couldn't, that we struggled to be witness and real about what was happening during the pandemic, and in not having been able to metabolize it, now there's this doubling down around, we're invulnerable, we're invincible, and I can't make the case for it in a way of proving it, but it's how it, the feeling of it, of what's going on right now, seems to be like that death avoidance and resistance is amplified. Corey.
Hi. I'm wondering if part of our fear of death and our inability to really grieve COVID is because of words that we use when we express it. Like, for example, a lot of what we're talking about right now is we talk about when there was COVID and using the word is
Yes.
or was, right?
Yeah.
When we know that, I mean, we know that it's still there and
It's
it's
still
still
here.
hurting, but it's not being published the same way it was, right? And so we're being told to forget, and we're being told to ignore. And so when you're being told to forget and ignore, you're not really being given the language that you need to be able to heal and to be able to prepare. And I wonder, like, not just with COVID, but with other things that are happening in our lives. And that might be part of why people tend to fear it, because you're not allowed to prepare something that doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think too, it's why, you know, these conversations, these gatherings are so important. Yeah. I'm going to invite other comments, but I'm also going to note that we're almost at the hour. That might be a good place to break, because then there's a new subheading in the next section of the introduction. As I kind of was guessing that we'd probably read about 10 pages each time. That's, in my experience, what we can cover. I'm just going to float the idea right now. I'll send out an email in the coming days, both about potentially meeting with James Rowe for a meditation, but also one thing I'm thinking about as we're talking, that, I mean, this is a happy place for me to be reading a book and talking about ideas and engaging with it in this cognitive way. But I'm having a wondering if maybe, and it might not be every week, but maybe every 2 or 3 weeks, if there are people that want to gather together to aim towards the being of this, maybe the doing, and if rather than strictly reading the book, if we could maybe have a chance to share what it is that we want to do with this information, like how does it look if we're bringing it into action. And so no need to have an answer right now. I'm not even sure what that could look like, but I want to bring it up as something for you to think about. And then by email, maybe we can have a little conversation if there's a desire or appetite for that, that maybe in addition to this book club, we could, yeah, the idea that that's actually, Corey, what I was thinking about, that like maybe we have a grieving ritual. Maybe we talk about, you know, mutual aid in communities. Maybe we do have a chance to meditate, to practice mindfulness around the fact that we will someday die. So a few different ideas. And before we close for the evening, any other reflections, thoughts, comments? That's maybe an introduction for many of you to this style of book clubbing, which, as I said at the start, is absolutely my favorite way of reading a book and being with each other and having the encounter together of the material. So I hope that it is as pleasing to you as it is to me. I'm going to stop the recording, and for those that listen online, we've made it to the end of page 9. We'll pick up with page 10 next week. So we'll get back to it soon.